out, then they should read it at least. Read this book. It's really good. Yep. Let's get started. All right. So I'm going to go back. Let me see here. I'm going to go back one thing. But the Algerian woman is not only in conflict with her body. This is where they're talking about how they have to change. She is linked, sometimes an essential one, in the revolutionary machine. She carries weapons, knows important points of refuge, and it is in terms of concrete danger that she faces that we must engage. The insurmountable victories that she has had to win in order to be able to say to her chief on her return, mission complete, RAS. Another difficulty to which attention deserves to be called appeared during the first months of the feminine activity. In the course of her comings and goings, it would happen that the unveiled Algerian woman was seen by a relative or a friend of the family. The father was sooner or later informed. He would naturally hesitate to believe such allegations. Then more reports would reach him. Different persons would claim to have seen Zora or Fatima unveiled, walking like a, quote, "My Lord protects us." The father would then decide to demand explanations. He would hardly have begun to speak when he would stop. From the young girl's look of a firmness, the father would have understood that her commitment was of long standing. The old fears of dishonor was swept away by a new fear, fresh and cold, that of death in battle or of torture of the girl. Behind the girl, the whole family, even the Algerian father, the authority for all things, the founder of every value following in her footsteps, becomes committed to the new Algeria. So they're saying like the new one is now the woman has some type of authority to be able to, and the father removes his position as head of the household and takes the position of understanding that the revolution needs to take place. Interesting. Big, huge cultural shift. Removing and reassumed again and again, the veil has been manipulated, transformed into a technique of camouflage, into a means of struggle. The virtually taboo character assumed by the veil in the colonial situation disappeared almost entirely in the course of the liberating struggle. Even Algerian women not actively integrated into the struggle formed the habit of abandoning the veil. It is true that under certain conditions, especially from 1957 on, the veil reappeared. The mission, in fact, became increasingly difficult. The adversary now knew, since certain militant women had spoke under torture, that a number of women, very Europeanized in appearance, were playing a fundamental role in the battle. Moreover, certain European women of Algeria were arrested, to the consternation of the adversary, who discovered that his own system was breaking down. The discovery by the French authorities of the participation of Europeans in the liberation struggle marks a turning point in the Algerian Revolution. Did you hear that? The discovery by the French authorities of the participation of Europeans in the liberation struggle marks a turning point in the Algerian Revolution. Let's go down to 16. It's just see chapter 5. Okay. From that day, the French patrols challenged every person. Europeans and Algerians were especially suspect. All historic limits crumbled and disappeared. Any person carrying a package could be required to open it and show its content. Thank you. Anyone was entitled to question anyone as to the nature of the parcel carried in Algiers, Filipinaville, or Batne. Under those conditions, it it became urgent to conceal the package from the eyes of the occupier, and again to cover oneself in the protective hayek. H-A-I-K, with the 2 dots on top of the I. Here again, a new technique had to be learned. How to carry a rather heavy object dangerously to handle under the veil and still give the impression of having one's hands free, that there was nothing under the hayek except a poor woman or an insignificant young girl. It was not enough to be veiled. One had to look so much like a Fatima that the soldiers would be convinced that this woman was quite harmless. Very difficult. 3 meters ahead of you, the police challenge a veiled woman who does not look particularly suspect. From the anguished expression and of the unit leader, you have guessed that she is carrying a bomb or a sack of grenades bound to her body by the whole system of strings and straps. For the hands must be free, exhibiting bare, humbly and abjectly present to the soldiers so that they will look no further. Showing empty and apparently mobile and free hands is the sign that disarms the enemy soldier. The Algerian woman's body, which in an initial phase was pared down, not swelled. Whereas in the previous period, that we're going back, in the previous period, the body had to be made slim and disciplined to make it attractive and seductive. It now, here's the other one, it now had to be squashed, made shapeless, and even ridiculous. So there's a different added to the development of the woman being engaging in this. This as we have seen is the phase during which she undertook to carry bombs, grenades, machine guns, and machine gun clips. The enemy, however, was altered, and in the streets, one witnessed that became a commonplace spectacle of Algerian woman glued to the wall. On those bodies, the famous magnetic detectors, the frying pans, would be passed. Every veiled woman, every Algerian woman became suspect. There was no discrimination. This was the period during which men, women, children, the whole Algerian people experienced at one and the same time their national vocation and the recasting of the new Algerian society. Ignorant or feigning to be ignorant of these new forms of conduct, French colonialism on the occasion of May 13th reenacted its old campaign of westernizing the Algerian woman. Servants under the threat of being fired, poor women dragged from their homes, prostitutes were brought to the public square and symbolically unveiled to the cries of "Viva la Algeria Francisca." Before this new offensive, old reactions reappeared, spontaneously and without being told. The Algerian woman who had long since dropped the veil once again donned the haki, the haik, H-A-I-K, thus affirming that it was not true that women liberated herself at the invention of France and the General de Gaulle. Behind those psychological reaction, beneath this immediate and almost unanimous response, we again see the overall attitude of rejection of the values of the occupier, even if these values objectively been chosen. It is because they fail to grasp this intellectual reality, this characteristic feature, the famous insensitivity of the colonized, that the colonizer rage at always, quote, doing them good in spite of themselves. Colonialism wants everything to come from it. But the dominant psychological feature of the colonized is to withdraw before an invitation of the conquerors. In organizing the famous conclave of May 13th, colonialism was obliged Algerian society to go back to the methods of struggle already outmoded. In a certain sense, the different ceremonies have caused a turning back, a regression. Colonialism must accept the fact that things happen without its control, without its direction. we are reminded of the words spoken in the International Assembly by the African political figure, responding to the standard excuse of the immaturity of colonial peoples and their incapacity to administer themselves. This man demanded for the underdeveloped peoples, quote, the right to govern themselves badly. The doctrinal assertion of colonialism in its attempt to justify the maintenance of its domination almost always pushed the colonized to the position of making uncompromising, rigid, static counter proposals. After the 13th of May, the veil was reassumed, but stripped once and for all of its exclusively traditional dimensions, meaning they probably just didn't care if they were veiled or not veiled. I'm guessing. There is thus a historical dynamism of the veil that is very concretely perceptible in the development of colonization in Algeria. In the beginning, the veil was a mechanism of resistance, but its value for the social group remained very strong. The veil was worn because tradition demanded a rigid separation of the sexes, but also because of the occupier was bent on unveiling Algeria. In the second phase, the mutation occurred in connection with the revolution, and under special circumstances, the veil was abandoned. This is the second thing. The veil was abandoned in the course of the revolutionary action. What had been used to block the psychological or political offensive of the occupier became a means and instrument. The veil helped the Algerian women to meet the new problems created by the struggle. The colonialists are incapable of grasping the motivations of the colonized. It is the necessity of combat that gives rise in Algeria society to new attitudes, to new modes of action, to new ways. You see, he went through the development of the Algerian woman engaged with the colonialism and how they helped with it. So they went from veiled to unveiled and then had to go back. And then this time they were just completely didn't care if you were veiled or unveiled. They still did their stop and frisk shit, seems like. In Appendix 17, just make sure. This text, which appears in Resistance Algérienne in its issue of May 16, 1957, indicates the consciousness that the leaders of the National Liberation Front, FLN, have always had of the important part played by the Algerian woman in the revolution. Happy Women's History Month, by the way, everybody. All right, let me find where the 17 is at. Oh yeah, it's up here. Got it. All right, so let's talk about appendix. On the Algerian earth, which is freeing itself day by day from the colonialist grips, we witness a dislocation of the old myths among things that are incomprehensible to the colonial world. The case of the Algerian woman has been all too frequently mentioned. The studies of sociologists, Islam specialists, and jurists are full of observation on the Algerian woman, described by turns as the man's slave or as the unchallenged sovereign of the home. Algerian women and her status absorbed the attention of theoreticians. Others of equal authority affirmed that the Algerian woman, quote, dreams of being free, but that a retrograde of ferocious patriarchy opposes this legitimate aspiration. The most recent debates of the French National Assembly indicated the interest attached to a coherent approach to this problem, quote unquote. The majority of the speakers described the fate of the Algerian woman and demand a improvement of her status. It is the only means of disarming the rebellion. Colonialist intellectuals consistently use the sociological case study approach to the colonial system. Such and such a country, they will say, called for, was crying for conquest. Ooh. Thus, to take a famous example, the Madagascan was described as having a dependency complex. Oh my God, this is very wild. So they're saying that they were waiting to be colonized because they need to be civil. As for the Algerian woman, she is inaccessible, ambivalent with, go lay down, with the meso, I know how to say it. Meso, I gotta look at it. Meso, oh my God. Hold on a second, everybody. Masochistic, sorry everybody, masochistic components. Specific behaviors are described with which illustrate these different characteristics. The truth is that the study of an occupied people militarily subject to an implacable domination requires documentation and checking difficult to combine. It is not the soil that is occupied. It is not the ports or the aerodromes. French colonialism has settled itself in the very center of the Algerian individual and has undertaken a sustained work of cleaning up, of expulsion of self, of rationally pursued mutilation. There is not occupation of territory on the one hand, and independence of person on the other. It is a country as a whole, its history, its daily pulsation. Let me look up this word again too. Hold on, everybody. Sorry, buddy, it's pulsation. That are contested, disfigured, in the hope that of a final destruction. Under these conditions, the individual's breathing is an observed and occupied breathing. It is a combat breathing. From this point on, the real values of the occupied quickly tend to acquire a clandestine form of existence. In the presence of the occupier, the occupied learns to dissemble, to resort to trickery, to the scandals of military occupation. He opposes a scandal of contact. Every contact between the occupied and the occupier is a falsehood. In 48 hours, the Algerian woman has knocked down all the pseudo-truths that years of field studies are believed to have amply confirmed. To be sure, the Algerian Revolution has brought about an objective modification of attitudes and outlooks, but the Algerian people had never disarmed. November 1st, 1954 was not the awakening of the people, but the signal it was waiting for in order to get into motion, in order to put into practice in full daylight the tactics required and solidly reinforced in the heyday of the Franco-Muslim period. The Algerian woman, like her brothers, had minutely built up defense mechanisms which enable her today to play a primary role in the struggle for liberation. To begin with, there is a much discussed status of the Algerian woman. Her alleged confinement, her lack of importance, her humility, her silent existence bordering on quasi-absence, and Muslim society, quote unquote, has made a place for her, amputated her personality, allowing her neither development nor maturity, maintaining her in a perpetual infantilism. Such affirmations, illuminated by scientific work, are today received in only valid challenge. The experience of revolution, the Algerian women's adherent love of the home is not a limitation imposed by the universe. It is not hatred of the sun or the streets or spectacles. It is not a fight from the world. What is true is that under normal conditions, an interaction must exist between the family and society at large. The home is the basis of the truth of society, but society authenticates it and legitimizes the family. The colonial structure is a very negation of this reciprocal justification. The Algerian woman, in imposing such a restriction on herself, in choosing a form of existence limited in scope, was deepening her consciousness for struggle and preparing for combat. This withdrawal, this rejection of the imposed structure, this falling back upon the fertile kernel that a restricted but coherent existence represents, constituted for a long time the fundamental strength of the occupied. All alone, the woman, by means of conscious techniques, presided over the setting up of the system. What was essential was that the occupier should constantly come up against a unified front. This account for the aspect of sclerosis that traditions must assume. The reality, the effervescence of the revolutionary spirit have been kept alive by the women in the home. For revolutionary war is not a war of men. It is not a war waged with the active army and reserve. Revolutionary war, as the Algerian people is waging, is a total war in which the women does not merely knit for or mourn the soldiers. The Algerian woman is at the heart of the combat. Arrested, tortured, raped, shot down, she testifies to the violence of the occupier and to his inhumanity. As a nurse, a liaison agent, a fighter, she bears witness to the depths and the destinies of the struggle. We shall speak also of the woman's fatalism, of her absence of reaction in the face of adversity, of her inability to measure the gravity of events, the constant smile, the persistence of an apparently unfolded hope. The refusal to go down on her knees is likened to the inability to grasp reality. The humor, which is a rigorous appraisal of the events, is unperceived by the occupier, and the courage that the Algerian woman manifests in the struggle is not an unaccepted criterion or a result of mutation. It is a intersectional phase of that same humor. The woman's place in Algerian society is indicated with such vehemence that the occupier's confusion is readily understandable. This is because Algerian society reveals itself not to be the womanless society that had been so conventionally described. Side by side with us, our sisters do their part in further breaking down the enemy system in liquidating the old mystifications once and for all. The Algerian woman. All right, chapter 2. Does anybody have any questions before I move on? Who's in here? No one is in here. Any questions? Doesn't look like we have any questions. What do we got back here? Hello from France. All right, cool. Doesn't look like we have. All right, let's move on then. All right, so that was the Algerian woman. That was her engagement and being part in the development of the woman engaging with the FLN and the revolutionary struggle, and the adaptations that women had to make in order to be able to be an important tool in the fight for liberation. So it was pretty good. Chapter 2. This is the voice of Algeria. We propose in this chapter to study the new attitudes adopted by the Algerian people in the course of the fight for liberation with respect to a precise technical instrument, the radio. We shall see that what is being called into question behind these new developments in Algerian life is the entire colonial situation. We shall have occasions to show throughout this book that the challenging of the very principle of foreign domination brings about essential mutations in the consciousness of the colonized, in the manner in which he perceives the colonizer in his human status in the world. Radio Algiers, the French broadcasting station, which has been established in Algeria for a decade, a re-edition of an echo of the French national broadcast system operating from Paris, is essentially the instrument of colonial society and its values. The great majority of Europeans in Algeria own receiving sets. Before 1945, 95% of the receivers were in the hands of Europeans. The Algerians who owned radio belonged mainly to the developing bourgeoisie and included a number of Kabyles, K-A-B-Y-L-E-S, who had formerly immigrated and had since returned to their villages. The sharp economic stratification between the dominant and the dominated society in large part explains this stage of things. But naturally, as in every colonial situation, this category of realities takes on a specific coloration. Thus, hundreds of Algerian families whose standard of living was sufficient to enable them to acquire a radio did not acquire one. Yet, there was no rational discussion to refuse this instrument. There was no organized resistance to this device. No real lines of counter acculturation, such are described by certain monographs devoted to underdeveloped regions, have been shown to exist even after intensive survey. It out nevertheless, and this argument may have appeared to confirm the conclusions of sociologists that pressed the question as to the reasons for this reluctance. Algerians rather frequently give the following answer: traditions of respectability are so important for us and are so hierarchical that it is practically impossible for us to listen to radio programs in the family. The sex allusions are even the clownish situation meant to make people laugh, which are broadcast over the radio, cause an unendurable strain in a family listening to these programs. End quote. The ever possible eventuality of laughing in the presence of the head of the family or the elder brother, of listening in common to amorous words or terms of levity, obviously act as a deterrent to the disruption of radios in Algerian native society. It is with reference to this first rationalization that we must understand the habit formed by the official radio broadcasting services in Algeria of announcing the program that can be listened to in common, and those in the course of which the traditional forms of sociability might be severely strained. Here, then, at a certain explicit level, is the apprehension of a fact. Receiving sets are not readily adopted by Algerian society. By and large, it refuses this technique, which threatens its stability and the traditional types of sociability. The reasons invoked being that the program in Algeria is undifferentiated because they are copied from the Western model, are not adapted to the strict, most feudal type of patrilineal hierarchy, which, with its many moral taboos, that characterizes the Algerian family. In the basis of this analysis, techniques of approach could be proposed. Among others, the staggering of broadcasts addressed to the family as a whole, to male groups, to female groups, etc. We as we describe the radical transformation that have occurred in this realm in connection with the national war, we shall see how artificial such a sociological approach is, what a mass of errors it contains. We have already noted that accelerated speeds with which the radio was adopted by the European society. The introduction of the radio in the colonized society proceeded at a rare comparable to that of the most developed Western regions. We must always remember that in the colonial situation in which, as we have seen, the social dichotomy reaches an incomparable intensity, there is a frenzied and almost laughable growth of middle-class gentility on the part of the national forms of the metropoles. For a European to own a radio is, of course, to participate in the internal round of Western petty bourgeois ownership, which extends from the radio to the villa, including the car and the refrigerator. It also gives him the feeling that colonial society is living in the palpitating reality, with its festivities, its traditions eager to establish themselves, its process, it's taking root, but especially in the hinterland, in the so-called colonization centers. It is the only link with the cities, with Algiers, with the metropoles, with the world of the civilized. It is one of the means of escaping the inert, passive, and sterilizing pressure of the native environment. It is according to the settlers' expression, quote, the only way to steal life like a civilized man, end quote. On the farms, the radio reminds the settler of the reality of colonial power, and by its very existence dispenses safety, serenity. Radio Algiers is a confirmation of a settler's right and strengthens this certainty in the historic continuity of the consequences, hence of his farm. The Paris music extracts from the metropolitan press. The French government crises constitute a coherent background from which colonial society draws its destiny and its justification. Radio Algiers sustains the occupant's culture, marks it off from the non-culture, from the nature of the occupied. Radio Algiers, the voice of France in Algeria, constitutes the sole center of reference at the level of news. Radio Algiers, for the settler, is a daily invitation not to go native, not to forget the rightfulness of his culture. The settlers in the remote outposts, the pioneering adventurers, are well aware of this when they say that, quote, without wine and the radio, we should already have become Arabanized. Don't ever, that's horrible. In Algeria, before 1945, the radio, as a technical news instrument, became widely distributed in the dominant society. And then, as we have seen, became both a means of resistance in the case of isolated Europeans, and a means of cultural pressure on the dominated society. Among European farmers, the radio was broadly regarded as a link with the civilized world, as an effective instrument of resistance to the corrosive influence of an inert native society, of a society without a future, backward and devoid of value. For the Algerian, however, the situation was totally different. So we just got done reading what the purpose of the radio for the settler was, to keep themselves contacted, to keep themselves with familiarity, to keep them contacted, to know that the colony is dominant, and that colonialism is dominant, and it keeps us from becoming like the Algerian. That's it. Yeah. Now we're shifting. I think we're shifting to what it means to the Algerian. For the Algerian, however, the situation was totally different. We have seen that the more well-to-do family hesitated to buy a radio set, not yet explicit, organized, and motivated resistance was to be observed, but rather a dull absence of interest in that piece of French presence. In rural areas and in regions remote from the colonization centers, the situation was clearer. There, no one was faced with the problem, or rather, the problem was so remote from the everyday concerns of the native that it was quite clear to an inquiry that it would be outrageous to ask an Algerian why he did not own a radio. A man conducting a survey during this period, who might be looking for satisfactory answers, would find himself unable to obtain the information he needed. All the pretexts put forth had, of course, to be carefully weighed at the level of actual experience. One cannot expect to obtain the rationalization of attitudes and choices. Two levels of explanation can be suggested here as an instrument technique. In the limited sense, the radio receiving set developed a sensorial, intellectual, and muscular power of man in a given society. The radio is occupied. Algeria is a technique in the hands of the occupier, which within the framework of colonial domination corresponds to no vital need insofar as the native is concerned. Now let's read this one. Radio Algeria is in fact one of the mooring lines maintained by the dominant society. Radio Monte Carlo, Radio Paris, Radio Ador, likewise play a protective role against urbanization, which is ridiculous. The radio as a symbol of French presence, as a material representation of the colonial configuration, is characterized by an extremely important negative valence, trying to commit to hide other posts. Okay. The possible intensification and extension of sensorial or intellectual powers by the French radio are implicitly rejected or denied by the native. The technical instrument, the new scientific acquisition, when they contain a sufficient charge to threaten a given feature of the native society, are never perceived in themselves a calm objectivity. The technical instrument is rooted in the colonial situation, whereas we know the negative or positive coefficients always exist in the very accentuated way. At another level, as a system of information, as a bearer of language, hence the message, the radio may be apprehended within the colonial situation in a special way. Radiophonic techniques, the press, and in general way, the system's messages, sign transmitters, exist in colonial society in accordance with a well-defined statute. Algerian society, the dominated society, never participated in this world of signs. The messages broadcast by Radio Alger are listened to solely by the representatives of power in Algeria, solely by the members of the dominant authority, and seems magically to be avoided by the members of the native society. The non-acquisition of receivers set by this society was precisely the effect of strengthening this impression of a closed and privileged world that characterizes colonialist news. In the matter of daily programs before 1954, eulogies addressed to the occupation troops were certainly largely absent. From time to time, to be sure, there might be an invocation over the radio of the outstanding dates of the conquest of Algeria, in the course of which, with an almost unconscious obscenity, the occupier would belittle and humiliate the Algerian resistance of 1830. There were also a commemorative celebration in which the Muslims, quote unquote, veterans would be invited to place a wreath at the foot of the statue of General Bagoud or Sergeant Blandan, both heroes of the conquest and liquidators of thousands of Algerian patriots. But on the whole, it could be said that the clearly racist, racialist, or anti-Algerian content accounted for the indifference and the resistance of the native. The explanation seems rather to be that Radio Alger is regarded by the Algerian as a spokesman for the colonial world. Before the war, the Algerian, with his own brand of humor, had redefined Radio Alger as Frenchmen speaking to Frenchmen. In 1945, was to bring Algeria abruptly into the international scene. For weeks, the 45,000 victims at Satif and of Galama were matters for abundant comment in the newspaper and information bulletin of regions until then unaware of or indifferent to the fate of Algeria. The tragedy of their dead or mutilated brothers, and the fervent sympathy conveyed to them by men and women in America, Europe, and Africa, left a deep mark in the Algerians themselves, foreshadowing more fundamental changes. The awakening of the colonial world and the progressive liberation of the people, long held in subjection, involved Algeria in the process which reached beyond her and of which, at the same time, she became a part. The appearance of liberated Arab countries at this point is an exceptional importance. The first wholesale introduction of radio sets in Algeria coincided with the setting up of national broadcast stations in Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon. After 1947 and 1948, the number of radios grew, but at a moderate rate. Even then, the Algerian, when he turned on his radio, was interested exclusively in foreign or Arab broadcasts. Radio Alger was listened to only because it broadcast typically Algerian music, national music. In the face of this budding Algerian market, European agencies began to look for native quote-unquote representatives. The European firms were now convinced that the sale of radio sets depended on the nationality of the dealer. Algerians intermediaries were increasingly solicited for the handling of radios. I gotta check out this word, everybody. Cannot pronounce it correctly. We're back. Yep, is a simple word as innovation. This innovation in the distribution system was accompanied by the intensification of the marketing of these sets. All right, I got to read it again. Shaif and Gulama, two central points in a Muslim uprising that occurred in the region of Kabylia in May 1945, and the repression which lasted some 2 weeks. Aviation and artillery took a heavy toll of lives. So it was during this period that a certain part of the Algerian lower middle class became owners of radios. But it was in 1951 through 52, at the time of the first skirmishes in Tanzania, that the Algerian people felt it necessary to increase their news network. In 1952 to 1953, Morocco undertook its war of liberation, and on November 1st, 1954, Algeria joined the anti-colonialist Maghreb Front. It was precisely at this time, while radio sets were being acquired, that the most important development occurred in the defining of new attitudes to this specific technique for the dissemination of news. It was from the occupiers' reaction that the Algerian learned that something grave and important was happening in his country. The European, through the triple network of the press, the radio, and its travels, had a fairly clear idea of the dangers threatening colonial society. The Algerian, who read in the occupier's face the increasing bankruptcy of colonialism, felt the compelling and vital need to be informed. The vague impression that something fundamental was happening was strengthened both by the solemn decision of the patriots, which expressed the secret yearning of the people and which embodied the determination, still devoid of content, even yesterday, to exist as a nation, and more especially by the objective and visible crumbling away of settler serenity. What is going on? Oh, someone's getting blocked. All right. The struggle for liberation reflected in the settlers' suddenly affability, or in his unexpected, unmotivated burst of temper, obliged the Algerian to follow the evolution of the confrontation step by step. In this period of setting up the lines of conflict, the Europeans committed many errors. Thus, on the farms, settlers would assemble agricultural workers to announce to them that a given gang of rebels, which in fact unknown to the region, had been decimated in the Aruz Mountains or in Kabylia. At other times, the servants would... Why? I don't want to do a co-host with you. I'm reading. At other times, the servants servants would be offered a bottle of lemonade or a slice of cake because 3 or 4 suspects had just been executed a few kilometers from the property. For the first month, the revolution in Algeria within a view of self-protection and in order to escape what he considered to be the occupiers' lying maneuvers, thus found himself having to acquire his own source of information. It became essential to know what was going on, to be informed both of the enemy's real losses and his own. The Algerian at this time had to bring his own life up to the level of the revolution. He had to enter the vast network of news. He had to find his way in a world in which things happened, in which events existed, in which forces were active. Through the experience of a war waged by his own people, the Algerian came in contact with the active community. The Algerian found himself having to oppose the enemy's news with his own news. The truth of the oppressor, formerly rejected as an absolute lie, was now countered by another, an acted truth. The occupier lie thereby acquire greater reality, for it was now a menaced lie, put on the defensive. It was a defensive. It was the defenses of the occupier, his reaction, his resistance, that underscored the effectiveness of national action and made that action participate in a world of truth. The Algerian reaction was no longer one of pained and desperate refusal, because it avowed its own uneasiness. The occupier's lie became a positive aspect of a nation's new truth. During the first month of the war, it was by means of the press that the Algerian attempted to organize his own news distribution system. The democratic press still existing in Algeria, and the newspaper with the anti-colonial traditions or a policy of objectivity were then avidly read by the native. It was in this sector of news distribution that the Algerian found balance restoring elements. The power of the colonialist message, the system used to impose it and present it as the truth, were such that most of the time the colonized had only his own increasingly overshadowed inner conviction to oppose to the imminently traumatizing offensive of the French press and the spectacular manifestation of the military and police power, confronting daily with, quote, wiping out of the last remaining guerrilla bands, end quote. The civilians could fight off despair only by an act of faith, by an obstinate belief. Progressively, the moral, because objective, support provided by the democratic press ceased. The self-censorship of the local newspaper, known for their traditional honesty, strengthened its impression of incompleteness, of sketchiness, even of betrayal in the realm of news. It seems to the Algerian that the whole section of truth were hidden from him. He felt the near certainty that the colonialist power was crumbling before his eyes, and that the progress of its dissolution was being kept from him. He fell prey to the sudden fear that this thing, so often hated, wounded to death in the Djebels, DJEBEL, its days probably numbered, would disappear without his being able to see at close hand its power and its arrogance and the process of disintegration. During this period, the Algerian experienced a sense of frustration. His aggressiveness remained a suspect because he could not keep the score, because he could not register the setbacks of the enemy hour by hour, because finally he could not measure centimeter by centimeter the progressive shrinking of the occupying powers. The European, on the whole, sized up the dimensions of the rebellion rather objectively. He did not really believe that some fine morning the revolutionary troops would take over in the city, but he knew more or less precisely how to get the forces of the revolution where, and he was constantly comparing them with those represented by the French troops. Every plane that shrieked the sky, every armored tank advancing in the dawn, were as many spots of sunlight in the settlers' anxious and uncertain world. The European felt the shock, but in those first months in 1955, he believed that nothing was lost, that there was still a future for colonialism in Algeria. The official statement of the radio strengthened him in his position. The Algerian, on the other hand, especially if he lived in the rural areas, supplemented his absence of news by the absolutely irrational reaction occurred at that time, which were so disproportionate to objective reality that to an observer they assumed the pathological character. In the first month of 1955, there were rumors of Constantine to the effect that Algiers, for example, was in the hands of the nationalists, or in Algiers, that the Algerian flag was hoisted over Constantine, Philippinaville, and Batani. Oh my God. Yeah, no worries. In the small colonization center of the settlers could not always understand the fellas, Fellah, fierce and sudden assurance that there were times when they could telephone to the nearest city only to have it confirmed that nothing unusual had happened in the country. The Europeans became aware of the fact that the life he had built on the agony of the colonized people was losing its assurance. Before the rebellion, there was the life, the movement, the existence of the settler, and on the other side, the continued agony of the colonized. Since 1954, the Europeans had discovered that another life parallel to his own has begun to stir, and that the Algerian society, it seems, things no longer repeat themselves as they did before. The Europeans after 1954 knew that something was being hidden from him. This is the period in which, this is a transformation, I think, the old pejorative expression, the Arab telephone, was taken on the almost scientific meaning. In the Maghreb country, the Europeans used the term Arab telephone in speaking of the relative speed in which news traveled by word of mouth into the native society. In the native society, never at any time was the expression intended to mean anything else. But in 1955, Europeans and even Algerians could be heard to refer confidentially, and as though revealing a state secret, to a technique of long-distance communication that vaguely recalled some such system of signaling, like the tom-tom, as is found in certain regions of Africa. The Algerian gave the isolated European the expression of being in permanent contact. Hold on a second, I gotta do a puzzle. Damn it! Such a thing. Isolation. Permanent contact with a revolutionary high command. He showed a kind of amplified self-assurance, which assumed rather extraordinary forms. There were cases of real running amok. Individuals in a fit of aberration would lose control of themselves. They could be seen dashing down the street or into a isolated farm, unarmed, or waving a miserable jagged knife, shouting, "Long live the independent Algeria! We've won." This aggressive kind of behavior, which assumed violent forms, would usually end in a burst of machine gun bullets fired by a patrol. When a doctor was able to exchange words with one of these dying men, the usual kind of expression he heard would be something like, "I don't believe them. We've got the upper edge. Our men are coming. We've been sent to tell you they're coming. We're powerful and will smash the enemy." These hysterical cases were sometimes merely wounded and were given over to the police for questioning. The pathological nature of their behavior would not be recognized, and the accused would be tortured for days until the press reported that he had been shot trying to escape while being transferred to another prison, or that he had died of the reoccurring ailments. In the dominant group, likewise, there were cases of mental wildness. People would be seized with a collective fear, and panicky settlers were seen to seek out outlets of criminal acts. What made the two cases different was that, unlike the colonized, the colonizer always translated his subjective states into acts real and multiply murders. Where we propose to deal with these different problems arise out of the struggle for liberation, in a study directly based in psychopathology, its forms, its original features, its description. On the level of news, the Algerian was to find himself caught in a network strictly confined in space. In a village, everyone is informed as to the numerical size and the equipment of the National Army of Liberation. On request, information as to its striking power and plan of operations can be obtained. No one, of course, can give the source of such information, but the reliability is unchallengeable. The description that has been given when the National Army collapsed, of the rapidity with which alarming, catastrophic, disastrous news spread among the people can serve as a system of reference to appraise the opposite phenomenon. In 1954, segments of a fifth column may have been discovered which were assigned to inoculate the French people with the virus of death, to defeat. But it must not be overlooked that the ground was already prepared, that there was a kind of spiritual demobilization due to the setbacks suffered by democracy in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, and especially at Munich. The defeatism of 1940 was the direct product of the defeatism of Munich. In Algeria, on the contrary, and this is true for all colonial countries that undertake a national war, all the news is good. Every bit of information is gratifying. The fifth column is an impossibility in Algeria. It is a recognition of this fact that leads sociologists to rediscover the old explanation according to which the native is inaccessible to reason or to experience. War specialists observe more empirically that these men have an iron morale, or that their fanaticism is incomprehensible. The group considered as a whole gives the impression of supplementing what it gets in the way of news by an assurance more or more cut off from reality. These manifestations, these attitudes of total belief, these collective convictions express the determination of the group to get as close as possible to the revolution, to get ahead of the revolution if possible. In short, to be on it, to be in on it. At the same time, we have seen, especially in the urban centers, more complex patterns of behavior coming to light. Avid for objective news, the Algerians would buy a democratic paper, the democratic papers that arrived from France. This meant the undeniable financial benefit for these papers. La Express, France Observer, La Monde increased their sales 3 and even 5-fold in Algeria. The men running the newspaper, Chaos, almost all of them Europeans, were the first to point out the economic and secondarily and political dangers that these publications represented. In studying the problem of the press in Algeria, one must always bear in mind one particularity in the distribution system. The public carriers, all young Algerians, sell only the local press. The European papers are not brought to the consumer. These papers have to be bought at the kiosk. The owners of the Algerian press immediately feel the competition of the press coming from France. Campaigns denouncing the press from being, quote, in cahoots with the enemy, and the repeated seizures of a certain number of these publications obviously assumed a special meaning. More and more news dealers, when asked for these papers, would reply aggressively that the SOB paper haven't arrived today. Algerians in the city, but especially in the rural centers, then discovered that showing concern over the arrival or non-arrivals of the said press was sufficient to label them in Algeria as in France, but of course more markedly, the newspaper kiosk dealers, like the office clerks, is sure to be a veteran with strong backing of ultra-colonialist circles. For the Algerian to ask the La Presse, the La Homati, these are all French words, or the La Mandi, was tantamount to publicly confessing, as likely as not, to the police informer his allegiance to the revolution. It was in any case an undergirded indication that he had reservations as to the official or colonialist news. It meant manifesting his willingness to make himself conspicuous. For the kiosk dealer it was the unqualified affirmation by the Algerian of solidarity with the revolution. The purchase of such a newspaper was thus considered to be a nationalist act. Hence, it quickly became a dangerous act. Every time the Algerian asked for one of these newspapers, the kiosk dealer, who represented the courier, the occupier, would regard it as an expression of nationalism, equivalent to an act of war, because they were now really committed to activities vital to the revolution, or out of understandable prudence. If one bears in mind the wave of xenophobia created by the French settlers in 1955, the Algerian adults soon formed a habit of getting young Algerians to buy these newspapers. It took only a few weeks for this new trick to be discovered. After a certain period of news dealers refused to sell La Express, La Hemanati, or Liberation to minors, adults were then reduced to coming out into the open, or less, to falling back to La École I can't say it. It was at this point that the political directorate of the revolution gave orders to boycott the Algerian local press. This decision had a double objective. First, to counter the offensive of the Algerian trust by a measure of having economic consequences, by depriving the Algerian papers of a large proportion of their native customers. The revolutionary movement was dealing a rather effective blow to the market of the local press. But above all, the political directorate was convinced that having to depend solely on colonialist news, the Algerians would gradually succumb to the massive and baneful influence of those pages, in which figures and photographs were complacently displayed, and where in any case one could clearly read every morning about the elimination of the revolution. On the level of the masses, which had remained relatively uninvolved in the struggle since they couldn't read the press, the necessity of having radio sets was felt. It must not be forgotten that the people generalized literacy left it indifferent to things written. In the first month of the revolution, the great majority of Algerians identified everything written in the French language as an expression of colonial domination. The language in which La Express and La Echo d'Alger were written was the sign of French presence. The acquisition of a radio set in Algeria in 1955 represented the sole means of obtaining news of the revolution from non-French sources. This necessity assumed a compelling character when the people learned that there were Algerians in Cairo who daily drew up the balance sheet of liberation struggles. From Cairo to Syria, from nearly all the Arab countries, the great pages written in the Dijabils by brothers, relatives, friends flow back to Algeria. Meanwhile, despite these new occurrences, the introduction of radio sets into the houses and the most remote daurs, D-O-U-A-R-S, proceeded only gradually. There was no enormous rush to buy receivers. It was at the end of 1956 that the real shift occurred. At this time, tracts were distributed announcing the existence of a Voice of Free Algeria. The broadcast schedule was, and the wavelengths were given. The voice, quote, that speaks from the DJEBLS, not graphically limited, but bearing to all Algeria the great message of the revolution, at once acquired the essential values. In less than 20 days, the entire stock of radio sets was bought up, and the SOUKS, I'm trying to read it. Trade in using receivers set began. Algerians who had served their apprenticeship with European radio electricians opened small shops. Moreover, the dealers had to meet new needs. The absence of the electrification in immense regions in Algeria naturally created special problems for the consumer. For this reason, battery-operated receivers from 1956 on were in great demand in the Algerian territory. In a few weeks, several thousand sets were sold to Algerians, who bought them as individuals, families, groups of houses, dowers, machitas. Since 1956, the purchase of a radio in Algeria has meant not the adoption of a modern technique for getting news, but the obtaining of access to the only means of entering into communications with the revolution, of living with it. In the special case of a portable battery set, an improved form of the standard receiver operating on current, the specialists of technical changes in underdeveloped countries might see a sign of a radical mutation. The Algerian, in fact, gives the impression of finding shortcuts and achieving the most modern forms of new communications without passing through the intermediary stages. In reality, we have seen that this progress is to be explained by the absence of electric current in the Algerian dowers. The French authorities did not immediately realize the exceptional importance of this change in attitudes of the Algerian people with regards to the radio. Traditional resistance broke down, and one could see in the dower groups of families in which fathers, mothers, daughters, elbow to elbow, would scrutinize the radio dial, waiting for the Voice of Algeria. Suddenly indifferent to the sterile, archaic modesty and antique social arrangements devoid of brotherhood, the Algerian family discovered itself to be immune to the off-colored jokes and the avidinous reference that the announcer occasionally let dropped. Okay, to SOUK, market or shops, that's what that is. Number 4, in the realm of military communication, the same phenomenon is to be noted. In less than 15 months, the National Army of Liberation, liaison, and telecommunication system became equal to the best to the best that is to be found in modern army. Mostly magically, let's see, we're doing good. Almost magically, but we have seen the rapid and dialectical progression of a new national requirements. The technical instrument of the radio receiver lost its identity as an enemy object. The radio set was no longer a part of the occupier's arsenal of cultural oppression. In making off of the radio a primary means of resistance, the increasingly overwhelming psychology and the military pressures of the occupant, the Algerian society made an autonomous decision to embrace the new technique, and thus tune itself in on the new signaling system brought into being by the revolution. The voice of fighting Algeria was to be a capital importance in consolidating and unifying the people. We shall see that the use of the Arab Kabylie, the French language, which was colonialism, which as colonialism has obliged to recognize, was the expression of a non-racial conception, had the advantage of developing and of strengthening the unity of the people, of making the fighting, oh my gosh, the Dajurajar, DJURDJURA area real for the Algerian patriots of Batni or of Numuras, I can't say it. The fragments and splinters of acts gleaned by the correspondents of the newspaper, more or less attracted to the colonial domination of communicating by the opposing military authorities, lost their anarchic character and became organized into a national and Algerian political idea, assuming their place in an overall strategy of the reconquest of the people's sovereignty. The scattered acts fitted into the vast epic of the Kabylies were no longer, quote, the men of the mountains, but the brothers who, with Omiran and Krim, made things difficult for the enemy troops. Having a radio meant paying one's taxes to the nation, buying the right of entry into the struggle of an assembled people. The French authorities, however, began to realize the importance of this progress of the people in the technique of news dissemination. After a few months of hesitancies, legal measures appeared. The sale of radios was now prohibited, except on presentation of a voucher issued by the military security or police services. The sale of battery sets was absolutely prohibited, and spare batteries were practically withdrawn from the market. The Algerian dealers now had the opportunity to put their patriotism to the test, and they were able to supply the people with spare batteries with exemplary regularity by resorting to various subterfuges. We're going to go down to number 5. The arrival of the arrival in Algeria by normal channels of new sets and new batteries obviously became increasingly difficult after 1956, and it was from Tanzania and Morocco via the underground that new supplies came. The regular introduction of these means of establishing contact with the official voice of the revolution became as important for the people as requiring weapons of munitions for the national army. Nice. Let's go back up. The Algerian who wanted to live up to the revolution had at last the possibility of hearing an official voice, the voice of the combatants, explain the combat to him, telling him the story of the liberation on the march, and incorporate it into the nation's new life. Here we come upon the phenomenon that is significantly unusual to retain our attention. The highly trained French services, rich with experience, acquired in modern war, past master in the practice of sound wave warfare, quote unquote, were quick to detect the wavelengths of the broadcasting stations. The programs were then systematically jammed, and the voice of the fighting Algeria soon became unalienable. The new form of struggle had come into being. Tracks were distributed, telling the Algerians to keep tuned in for a period of 2 or 3 hours. In the course of the single broadcast, a second station broadcast over a different wavelength would relay the first jammed station. The listener, enrolled in the battle of the waves, had to figure out the tactics of the enemy and in an almost physical way circumvent the strategy of the adversary. Very often only the operator, his ear glued to the receiver, had the unhoped for opportunity to hearing the voice. The other Algerians present in the room would receive the echo of his voice through the privileged interpreter, who, at the end of the broadcast, was literally besieged. Specific questions would then be asked of this incarnated voice. Those present wanted to know about the particular battle mentioned by the French press in the last 24 hours. And the interpreter, embarrassed, feeling guilty, would sometimes have to admit that the voice had not mentioned it. But by comment, I'm gonna look ahead just real quick because I got 10 minutes. Let's remember page 92. 92. Because if not, I'm gonna have to find a stopping point. 92. Yeah. Yep. 92. Remember 92, please. Okay, we're gonna find a stopping point. I have to find a stopping point. All right. But by common consent, after the exchange of views, it would be decided that the voice had in fact spoken of these events, but that the interpreter had not caught the transmitted information. A real task of reconstruction would then begin. Everyone participate in the battles of yesterday and the day before would be refought in accordance with the deep aspirations and the unshakable faith of the group. The listener would compensate for the fragmentary nature of the news by an autonomous creation of information. Listen to the voice of Fighting Algeria was motivated not by just the eagerness to hear the news, but more particularly by the inner need to be at one with the nation in its struggle to recapture and to assume the new national formulation. To listen to and to repeat the grandeur of the epic being accomplished up there among the rocks and on the Djebels. Every morning the Algerian would communicate the result of his hour of listening in. Every morning he would complete, for the benefit of his neighbor or his comrade, the things not said by the voice, and reply to the assiduous questions asked by the enemy pressed. He would counter the official affirmation of the occupier, the resounding bulletin of the adversary with official statements issued by the revolutionary command. Sometimes it was the militant who would circulate the assumed point of view of the political directorate because of a silence on this or the fact which, if prolonged, might prove upsetting and dangerous for the people's unity. The whole nation would snatch fragments of sentences in the course of a broadcast and attach to them the decisive meaning, imperfectly heard, obscured by the innocent jamming, forced to change wavelengths 2 or 3 times in the course of a broadcast. The voice of Fighting Algeria would hardly ever be heard from beginning to end. It was a choppy, broken voice from one village to the next, from one shack to the next. The voice of Algeria would recount new things, tell of more and more glorious battles, pictured vividly the collapse of the occupying power. The enemy lost its density, and at all levels at all level of the consciousness of the occupied experience a series of essential setbacks. Thus, the voice of Algeria, which for months led the life of a fugitive, which was tracked by the adversary's powerful jamming networks, and whose word was often unaudible, nourished the citizens' faith in revolution. I think I'm going to stop there. We're going to stop right there. We're going to stop where it says, this voice whose presence was felt, whose reality was sensed, assumed more and more. Hold on a second. I'll go back. We'll go back a little bit. I'm not good at finding stopping points, so everybody forgive me. Not good at it. Add a bookmark. And then take the bookmark off. Alright, 93 is where we stopped. Right? 93, I thought. 93. Yeah, 93. All right, we'll stop right there. Now we're getting into, we got into the fundamentals of the radio and why it's important in it and why it was developed into the resistance to keep the population and the Algerian people connected to the revolution, because they were getting propaganda from the French to say that, and they weren't telling the whole truth because they were losing the initiative. They were losing, but the French would say they weren't. So they could keep them not attached to the liberation movement. And we went through the process of, they first denied it because they didn't want the whole, like, they didn't want the radio and be like, you know, to assimilate into French culture and stuff. And the French kept it because it kept them attached to the colonialist position and everything, and helped the Algerian places where they were at to be Frenchized, if that makes sense. And then they talked about how, like, they utilized newspapers and certain newspapers in order to get information, and when the state saw those things, it changed. So then they had to adapt to the radio, and then when the radio came up, they found out, and then they had to adapt to another development, which is trying to interpret all the broken up messages from the voice of Algeria. So these are the developments of the resistance of the Algerian people, staying connected with the resistance and not being propagandized by the state. So, very good development. We'll find out more. We'll go through more and more. We're not done with the radio yet. But like, the first part was about the Algerian woman and their functions and their development within the revolution, the FLN, and now we're looking at the radio. So, very good stuff. Does anybody have any questions before I drop? Since there's only 3 of us in here. Any questions? Anybody want to come up and talk about anything? It is open. No? No one has any questions? No one wants to come up, say anything? All right. Looks like we are done then, since no one wants to come up. It's fine. Hopefully next time we'll have more people to be a part of this. It really helps. It helps people's involvement and people's participation to be able to drive the conversation to a good direction. All right, everybody. Well, on top of that, I will talk to you later. I hope you all have a good night.